Hello everyone and welcome to this video lecture on Chapter 21, Part 2, which is on standard costs. And standard costs, as I will explain momentarily, are really about setting expectations and then comparing those expectations to reality. So in this lecture, the things that I hope that you will learn are: what are standard costs? How does the concept of standard cost relate to the budget process that we learned about in the previous chapter? We're going to learn about the different types of standards, and the Q and the P, you'll learn what those stand for later, but there are different standards for direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. We'll learn about the difference between an ideal versus a practical standard and which one businesses should use. We're going to learn about different types of standard cost variances. And finally, we'll come back to how are standard costs helpful in business. Because remember, the whole point of all of this, everything that we do in accounting, is that it is meant to be helpful to business managers. So I'll explain to you how standard costs can help businesses. So first of all, what are standard costs? Well, let's break it down. There's two words there, right? Standard and cost. So the word standard, you've probably heard before. Like if people say, oh, he has really high standards or she has really low standards or whatever it is. But the term standard really means an expectation, right? What do you expect of the people around you or the quality of your food or whatever it is you have an expectation for? And this relates to the concept of budgeting, because a budget is also kind of an expectation or a plan for what the company wants to accomplish. So that's why I have this target here, because that's what it is. It's an expectation, a target, what we're trying to shoot for, what we want our business to accomplish. So that's the standard piece. And then the term cost refers to, in this case, the costs of producing our product. And as we learned way back in, I think, Chapter 14, there are three components of inventory costs, which are direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. So really, a standard cost is an expectation or budget for the cost of producing inventory. So all standards are based on, there's two, types of standards for each component of inventory cost, and that's quantity and price. So to come up with your standard, you have to know the quantity or amount of direct materials and direct labor and overhead that go in, as well as the price or the dollar amount of direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. Okay, so you have to set a standard for both quantity and the dollar amount. So for direct materials, for example, quantity refers to the quantity of raw materials that are needed. And so, for example, if we were making a cake, we would look at our recipe or our cookbook, and it would tell us how many eggs go into the cake. But the recipe will only tell us the quantity, how much goes in. If you were making other types of things, maybe you would ask the engineers, how much wood do I need to build that desk? Or how many yards of fabric do I need to make that dress? That all is what I mean by quantity. But those things won't tell you the price or the dollar amount you have to pay for the eggs or the wood or the fabric. Okay, that's something separate. That's a price standard. So the question is, what is the price of each egg? What is the price of a yard of fabric? What is the price of a square, foot of wood? Okay, so we have to set a standard for both of those things. How much of the material we need, as well as the price or expected amount that we would have to pay for those materials. So for that, obviously, we would look at the price tag. Okay. So let's say, for example, our recipe said that our cake requires 3 eggs, and each egg costs 20 cents. Okay, so you would look, your quantity standard for direct materials would be 3 eggs. Your price or dollar standard would be 20 cents per egg for a total cost of 60 cents. Okay, now obviously I know that the cake is going to have other ingredients besides eggs, but just to keep this example simple, we're just going to only talk about eggs. But just know that in reality, if a product requires eggs and flour and sugar, we're going to set a separate standard for each of those materials. How much sugar do we need, and what is the price of sugar? How many cups of flour do we need, and what is the price per cup of flour? Okay, but do we only use 3 eggs to make a cake? Well, in an ideal world, yeah, that's what the recipe says, right? But sometimes it doesn't quite work out that way in reality, right? Because sometimes eggs break, or we crack open an egg and it's like stinky and rotten inside. So sometimes we end up using more eggs than even the recipe calls for. Now, this concept is a concept of setting an ideal standard versus a practical standard. So, an ideal standard means in an ideal world, if nothing went wrong, if we never broke an egg, if we never had a rotten egg, this is the standard we would use. But since we know that's not reality, instead we want to use a practical standard. And a practical standard allows for a typical amount of problems. So a typical amount of eggs that you might break, or a typical amount of rotten eggs you might find. Now, of course, we don't want that to be a large amount, but we want it to be realistic. So standards should build in allowances for things like this, for waste, for errors, but it should be a reasonable amount, not too much, because we don't want to set that expectation for our employees that, yeah, you can make a lot of mistakes, it's no big deal, you can drop eggs, no big deal. But we don't also want them to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to be perfect. If I ever make a mistake, they're going to fire me. We don't want that to happen. So we want to just be practical about it, be reasonable. Okay? So your standards should build in allowances. So what does that look like? Well, maybe we would say, now our egg quantity isn't 3 eggs, maybe it's like 3.1 eggs. That allows us for maybe every 10 cakes, we might break 1 egg. Okay, not a big deal. It's reasonable. Okay, so we would change our quantity to 3.1 eggs times 20 cents per egg, and that would come out to 62 cents. Okay. The next category of cost is direct labor. So for direct labor standards, we still have that same concept of quantity and price, but the terms we use are a little bit different. So for quantity, we're really looking at time. Okay, how long does it take to make this product? So how much time should the job take? So in order to figure that out, we would, time our chef literally making the cake. How long does it take you to make this cake? And that would be the normal amount of time. Maybe we'd time them a few times to see what a reasonable amount of time is, and that would be our time standard. We also refer to this as efficiency, because efficiency means doing something in a short amount of time, is doing it efficiently, not wasting time. Okay, and then we also have to think of the price or dollar amount, and that is the labor rate. So what is the hourly rate of the chef? And that's going to be your price standard. So what is the normal hourly rate for a chef? So let's say then we go here to our, by the way, I forgot to mention, this is what we would call a standard cost card, which is where we kind of track for every product the standards or expectation that we set of quantity and price for each of these items. And so let's say that it takes our chef 3 hours to make a cake, and we pay the chef $15 an hour. Well, if you took quantity times price, that would get you a total labor cost of $45 per cake. Now, again, if you had more than one person working on this cake, say you had a chef who made the batter, and then separately you had a cake decorator who decorated the cakes, you would, they might have different amounts of time and different labor rates, and you would list each one of those out separately. But again, I'm just trying to keep this example simple so we can follow along. And then last but not least are the overhead standards. And I'm going to warn you that the overhead standards are a little bit more complex. And in fact, I'm not even going to talk about them much in this video other than this little brief introduction. We'll talk about them more in class. But it still follows that same concept of quantity and price. And a lot of these terms that I'm using are going to be reviewed from chapter 15. So if you forgot about these terms, you may want to go back to chapter 15 and review them. But the quantity refers to the activity base. So if you recall, we say that because it's very hard to measure overhead, we base overhead on an activity base. So for an example would be direct labor hours. So if a product takes more time to make, it would also incur more overhead cost. So whatever activity base we're using, if it's direct labor hours or machine hours, depending on the product, that's going to be our quantity amount. So again, we're just going to use, if it's direct labor hours, how much time should the job take, and we'll just time that. And then for the dollar piece, for that, we're going to use the predetermined overhead rate. And if you recall from chapter 15, again, that's an estimate that shows the relationship between overhead costs and the activity base. So in other words, for what amount of overhead cost is incurred for each direct labor hour. Because we can't really measure rent and utilities and all of that stuff. So instead we say, well, we're going to assume that if something takes a certain amount of time to make, it's also using a certain amount of rent, utilities, supervisor salaries, so on and so forth. So your quantity is going to be whatever your activity base is that you're basing your predetermined overhead rate on. And then the dollar piece is going to be that predetermined overhead rate. So for example, if we had a predetermined overhead, or we said that something, again, the quantity is based on direct labor hours. So we would say it's 3 direct labor hours. And then our predetermined overhead rate, we're going to say that for every direct labor hour, the product requires or uses up $10 of overhead costs. And again, that's a combination of your rent, utilities, supervisor salaries, indirect materials, indirect labor, all of that stuff. So you would multiply the quantity times the price, and that would get you $30 of total overhead costs. Now again, these are all estimates, expectations of what we expect to happen. So what do standards have to do with the budget process? Well, as we learned about the budget process in chapter 20, budgets have 5 different benefits. They help with planning, communicating the plan, coordinating the plan amongst various parties within the organization, motivating employees to meet that plan, and then also control, which is seeing, were we able to meet our plan or not. So standard costs really help with this whole process because, again, it's a plan. Oops, sorry. Sorry, it is a plan, right? So it allows, using standard costs helps us plan production. It helps us to know how much materials to purchase, how to schedule our labor so that we know how much time it's going to take to make each thing. So standards are very helpful for the planning process. But in addition, standards are helpful in the control phase. Okay, so in the control phase, that's where we're comparing actual to budget. Well, when it comes to standards, we do that same thing. And we calculate the difference, which we call variances. And you already learned that term variances in part 1 of chapter 21 when we talked about flexible budgets. But variances can, in this case, are differences between the standard cost and the actual cost. And just like we learned under flexible budgets, we use the same terms favorable and unfavorable for standard cost variances. So favorable standard variance is going to be if the costs are lower than expected. Unfavorable is going to be if the costs are higher than expected. So stay tuned and we'll talk more about variances in the next video.